Good evening, everyone. Shalom, salam, pax. Peace to all of you who have gathered this evening for the second of 4 webinars on the theme, A Better Future for Israelis and Palestinians, affirming the sacredness of all human life. We've been richly blessed by the efforts and the diligence of 2 organizations that are vital to New England's social, cultural, and spiritual life. These are the Boston Workers Circle, Center for Jewish Culture and Social Justice, and the Islamic Council of New England. These 2 organizations have provided us the opportunity to gather this evening and discuss a topic essential for our shared future. We also want to thank the sponsors who have helped to make this evening's event possible. Each of the 4 webinars in this series invites us to ask a vital question. Last week, the question was, can we talk and listen to one another? This week, we gather to discuss the sanctity of the Holy Land and ask the question, can we share? Can we recognize and honor the sanctity of the places in the Holy Land sacred to Jews, Christians, and Muslims? My name is Joe Kelley. For the past 47 years, I've been a professor of religious and theological studies at Merrimack College in North Andover, Massachusetts, where for over a decade, I also directed the College Center for the Study of Jewish, Christian, Muslim relations. In that capacity, I have come to know and value so many treasured friends in the Islamic Council of New England, and so many leaders and cherished colleagues in Jewish communities here in the Merrimack Valley and Greater Boston. Each of our speakers this evening is a blessing, a gift to us, as we strive to navigate the troubled waters of our world. I would now like to invite each of them to speak in turn for 10 to 12 minutes, addressing that question that will guide us through our program about the sanctity of the Holy Land. Can we share? After their individual presentations, we will have a 15-minute discussion among the 3 panelists, followed by a question and answer period in which members of the audience will be able to submit questions to the panelists through the Q&A function of the webinar. I would like to introduce our first panelist and speaker, Rabbi Barbara Penzner. Rabbi Penzner has served Temple Hillel B'nai Torah in West Roxbury since 1995. She has served as president of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association and as president of the Massachusetts Board of Rabbis. Rabbi Penzner lived in Israel for a year while studying to be a rabbi and spent the years 1993 to 1995 in Jerusalem. She has been co-chair of the Jewish Labor Committee, New England. In 2011, Rabbis for Human Rights, now TRUA, the Rabbinic Voice for Human Rights, named her a Rabbinic Human Rights Hero for her work with the Hyatt Hotel workers. Rabbi Penzner.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And thank you to the 2 organizations for inviting us to this holy conversation. It's a great honor to be among such esteemed and devoted pursuers of peace, and to the Arabic speakers, I say assalamu alaikum, and to our Jerusalem guests, marhaba, good morning, and shalom to all of you. I want to also say how grateful that I am to those who spoke on the first program. They set a very powerful foundation for deep listening and help us frame that as the way that we talk about these difficult issues. I'd like to begin with a piece of poetry written in the 1100s by one of the greatest Hebrew poets, Yehuda Halevi, lived in Spain under Muslim rule. And he wrote these lines, Libi b'mizrach va'anochi b'sof ma'arav. My heart is in the east, and here am I at the uttermost west. Clearly in 1100, Spain was as far west as anyone could imagine. And yet he felt this pull this out-of-body experience that he needed to be in the Holy Land, which is what he meant by the East, which is where Jews face traditionally in prayer. And he was so pulled by that, that even though he was living in comfort and in a civil society in the Golden Age, what we refer to as the Golden Age of Spain, he left Spain for the land of Israel, which was then under the control of Crusaders, and he died there. That's how I want to set up this notion of what it means classically, traditionally, for Jews to feel a connection to the Holy Land and also to Jerusalem. As I said, I consider this a holy mission to be invited here to share with you, Jews, Christians, Muslims, non-believers. I would like to present a full picture of Jewish connection across the ages, a connection that animates many Jews, not only in Israel, but across our diaspora, in their love and their devotion for the land. And I mean the land, particularly, and not only the state of Israel, although that is certainly an important aspect of many Jewish people's lives. But the state is a modern entity that followed many different eras of varying rulers over that little corner of the earth. And the connections that I espouse, especially as I speak to Jews, may not be your own personal beliefs. But my intention is not to judge these narratives or to judge you if you don't embrace them. Whether you resonate with what I have to say or not, I believe it's important for these underpinnings of this conversation to be heard and not dismissed as antiquated or racist. The hard work that we need to do as we listen, as we were told last time, is to wrestle with what is so that we can join together to imagine what might be. So I divide our connection to this land in 3 words: myth, memory, and mitzvah, and I'll explain each. So by myth, I refer to sacred myth, not myth in a dismissive way, but myth in understanding the deep underpinnings of a story and its message and its meaning, regardless of whether you believe that that story actually happened as fact. I was talking to 3rd and 4th graders today about the story of Adam and Eve and trying to help them understand this was not a biology lesson, that it's a myth, it's a story from which we draw sacred truths. And the same is certainly true in my understanding, in my training as a rabbi, that the Torah itself, the stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, are not meant to be history. They are sacred myth. They have deep truths about the world, about the divine, about our purpose as human beings. And so those are the myths that animate a Jewish understanding of the connection to this land. So I have a sister who lives just outside of Hebron. She is a settler. She lives on a yeshuv. And when I agreed at one point for a family event, I agreed to go visit her there after much deliberation. And her husband looked out over his patio and said, "This is where Avraham Avinu, our father Abraham, walked." And I had to hold in a laugh because he meant it very seriously. And it's very important to him. And for me, Avraham is not a person who I believe actually walked the land in history. However, having walked that land with a Bible in my hand throughout Hebron and the Judean hills, I'm well aware that those myths, those stories in our Hebrew scriptures do describe the land even as it is today. And when you see the pomegranates and the grapes, and it recalls stories that we read in Torah. Among those myths, we have to admit, as in any religious tradition, there are difficult texts. There are texts we would rather expunge, but holy texts cannot be expunged, and so we argue with them. And there are certainly disturbing texts about the conquest of the land. Not that I personally believe that Joshua drove out all the people of Canaan, but there are statements about destroying the idols of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, and the Hivites numerous times that we need to face as part of that myth that animates people. But I give thanks that Judaism is a tradition of interpretation and that we can reinterpret texts in many ways. That's myth. It connects us through story. And second is memory. Memory for me is both a communal memory, it includes history, and it's also personal memory. So the deepest communal memory for the Jewish people is that from 2,500, 3,000 years ago, there was Jewish sovereignty in the land, and that the heart of it became Jerusalem, where the Holy Temple was established and then destroyed, first by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. Then the people came back from exile, rebuilt. A second temple was created, making Jerusalem the most sacred center of Jewish life, even when there was a diaspora that existed even then in Babylonia who didn't return. And that was destroyed once again by the Romans in 70 CE. And it was so destroyed that the Romans made it prohibitive for any Jew to even set foot there. And yet, Jews continued to dwell in that land, and as Yehuda HaLevi proved, to emigrate to that land time and again. And as Jews, traditional or non-traditional, most synagogues are facing Jerusalem. That is our site of prayer. And we mention Jerusalem and Zion, which becomes Israel and Jerusalem together, is what we pray for and pray toward. And finally, there's mitzvah, which is Jewish obligation. Now, my sister understands mitzvah in a very strict structural way, that those are the commandments that one must follow. And for her, living in the land of Israel, living on that land, is fulfilling one of the greatest mitzvot there is. For me, one of the greatest mitzvot that I can fulfill is to be an educator among diaspora Jews. Yet we both embrace this idea of mitzvah. And mitzvah has been used against the population of Palestinians, against Muslims. I was living in Jerusalem and celebrating the holiday of Purim when the helicopters flew over us and we found out that Baruch Goldstein had mercilessly murdered Muslim worshippers in Ma'arat HaMachpelah in Hebron, in the cave of Machpelah, sacred to Jews and Muslims. And he used the mitzvah that he read of destroying the inhabitants of the land as his excuse. That is something we need to not only change, we need to condemn, but we also need to know that it's there. I want to close by offering a new mitzvah, and it comes from my good friend and colleague, Rabbi Toba Spitzer, who has offered in contrast the mitzvah of Ahavat Yoshvei Haaretz, which is to love all who dwell on the land. That we take on an obligation of staying in relationship to the place, and not just to our own people, whoever we are, but to all the people who dwell on the land. And she teaches that this is ultimately a spiritual challenge, not a political one. And in my experience over 40 years of visiting Israel, visiting Palestine, meeting all kinds of people, religious and secular, westernized and fundamentalist, settlers, Jewish and Palestinian peace activists, I have learned that there is a growing group of people who are doing that holy work on the ground of loving one another and creating the foundation for a future peace, whatever it looks like. And it is based on this one teaching. My people's claim to the land is a total claim. The Palestinians' claim to the land is a total claim. To carve up the land into two makes us both suffer. And when we can talk to each other and understand that total claim, then perhaps there's a possibility to make space for each other, living together justly, equitably, sharing water resources, sharing judicial systems. And I'm not talking about a political solution here. I am talking about groups like Roots, Shorashim Judur, which is a joint initiative for nonviolent transformation that brings together Jewish settlers and West Bank Palestinians. And I am proud to say that I recently learned that my sister and her husband are participating in a 5K and a 10K walk for that organization. And that was an enormous gift that I received from her that I had never expected to hear. For me, there is hope. And if we can listen and stay in connection with people on the ground who are willing to listen to each other and to tell our stories authentically, I believe there's hope for us to share this very holy land. Thank you very much.
Professor Kelley, you are muted.
Thank you. Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Thank you, Barbara, for that very powerful and moving witness, and for connecting us, reconnecting us to the themes of sacred myth, of memory, personal and communal, and of mitzvah. And your words of hope are encouraging and will help carry this conversation further. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Abu Sway. We need to give him a special word of thanks because he's coming to us from Jerusalem, where it is much later than here in the United States. Dr. Abu Sway is a member of the Hashemite Fund for the Restoration of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, the Royal Al-Bayat Institute for Islamic Thought, and the Islamic Council in Jerusalem. He's featured on the Muslim 500 list of the world's most influential Muslims. He was appointed as the first holder of the integral chair for the study of Imam Al-Ghazali's work at the Holy Al-Aqsa Mosque and at Al-Quds University. He earned his PhD from Boston College here in New England, and he contributed significantly to the exhibition on Jerusalem 1000 to 1400, Every People Under Heaven, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Dr. Abu Sway.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind invitation and for the generous introduction. I am Jerusalemite. My family lived on the slopes of Mount of Olives for generations. And I'm very fortunate to have a manuscript where one of my great grandparents has been a Sufi Muslim mystic listed on a chain of Sufis who dwelled in the city that I have known since childhood. I literally live at a walking distance from the old city, though I do park my car when I go to Al-Aqsa Mosque at a nearby parking lot. I enter through Lion's Gate typically. Very rarely that I would enter the old city from other gates. And if you go early in the morning, so even if it's not that early, you'll see Franciscans, Catholic priests, Greek Orthodox priests, and nuns leaving usually the old city to the nearby Gethsemane. And that's exactly to the Gethsemane Church, and that's exactly where I used to play as a child from Ras Al Amud, from Silwan, knowing the ancient city of Jerusalem. People remember the old city. It's very easy, of course. It's part of the image of Jerusalem, with Al-Aqsa Mosque, including the famous Dome of the Rock being part of it, defining really even aesthetically and not on the level of that which is holy. I knew the Silwan pool where I played as a kid, but later on in my life, even the Warren Shaft, for me, we did not need somebody from overseas to come and discover the Warren Shaft. I've seen it as a kid. I knew what it was. Imagining that there would be some kind of a citadel up there on the hill, which is called the Ophel. But that's exactly where Yabus and the Jebusites existed when the narrative about Prophet King David, when he conquered the city of Jerusalem, which was at the time, that's exactly what it was, probably more of a modest neighborhood in the life of the city. And by mentioning the Jebusites, that's not exactly what begins life in the Holy Land, which is not to be conflated with geopolitical borders. Holiness does not stop at borders, at barbed wire, at separation walls. That's not the role of holiness or blessedness. The life of the Holy Land, we talk at least in document, that's which the archaeologists document. We talk about Jericho as being the oldest agricultural settlement in the world, and that's about 12,000 years ago. So there have been many peoples, different backgrounds, who dwelled in the land. So being first is definitely a claim that cannot be validated easily. Jews, Christians, and Muslims cannot basically claim that they have been here first compared to those who dwelled in the land for thousands of years. And the Philistines, though we don't talk about probably monotheists, but they have been dwelling in the land with findings in the caves of Haifa, talk about tens of thousands of years of presence on this land. And it has been probably the path for human beings who went from Africa to the east and then later on to the north to Europe. But having said that, the text of the Quran speaks about the journey at night journey, if you will, and that's a connection. It does speak about the connection between Mecca and Jerusalem, between the noble sanctuary in Mecca and the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. And the Al-Aqsa Mosque, in the writings of Mujir Din Hanbali, and that's the only Muslim grave near the Church of the Gethsemane, immediately on the road. Literally 500 years ago, he wrote in his history about Jerusalem and Hebron, Al-Uns al-Jalil fi Tarikh al-Quds wal-Khalil. He said that Al-Aqsa Mosque is the name of the space, so not the buildings. And this is where he took a team and he measured twice the length and width of the twice the length and twice the width of the of Al-Aqsa Mosque. And the width, he measured that from the Bab al-Rahmah, you know it in English as the Golden Gate, all the way to the Tankaziyya school on the western side, which has been confiscated by the Israeli occupation authorities, and they use it as a security establishment. And part of it is literally of the Tankaziyya is above the courtyards of Al-Aqsa Mosque. The different Israeli government ministries try to define Al-Aqsa Mosque for us as the southernmost building, and as such they consider the courtyards as part of public space, like public parks. And the same thing is applied to the cemeteries surrounding the old city. We have had most recently, within the last few days, an incident in which the municipality, the Israeli municipality, that is bulldozers and contractors, basically plowing into the graves in the Yusufiyya cemetery, right at the northern eastern edge of the old city, and human remains were found, and that proved to be another fuse in a very volatile situation. But not as part of a, they wanted to establish a park, as if we really need a park on the cemetery. And on the western side, just 2-3 minutes walk from Newgate or Jaffa Gate, we have the Mamela cemetery, where the municipality granted permits to Rabbi Hire to build a very massive museum of tolerance, and that's where the Abrahamic reunion, let's say, took place in Jerusalem a couple of days ago. Israeli newspapers spoke about exhuming the remains from 400 graves on the Islamic cemetery, and this really shows a certain power structure that does not respect very much the holy space, including the cemeteries. We do face difficulties, but the land itself is holy. Jerusalem itself is holy, and I have translated almost 30 prophetic traditions about the holiness and blessedness and the end of time scenarios, really, about Jerusalem in these prophetic traditions. And still there are few more that need to be translated. In the hadith of Maimuna, in that tradition, she asked about our relationship with Jerusalem, and the Prophet said, using imperative language, go and pray there, but not before he says that. He said that it's the land of gathering and resurrection, alluding to end of time scenarios, but he said, go and pray there. And she exclaimed, and he mentioned that in Jerusalem, the prayer has a higher virtue, higher religious value by praying in Jerusalem compared, let's say, to a mosque in Europe or in the United States. And then she exclaims about those who cannot make it. He said, then they can send the gift of oil to be burnt in its lanterns. And I understand this prophetic tradition as saying two things. The first relationship with the holy place here is that which is spiritual, and the second one is maintenance. The Jordanian Hashemite royal family has been the custodians of Al-Aqsa Mosque, but not only the Muslim holy site, but also the Christian holy sites for the last century, a little bit more even. And often we have difficulty doing really very small jobs. Let's say a pipe burst and water is running, and the Israeli police would prevent the maintenance, the Waqf administration, the Islamic Endowment Administration from doing their job. Regarding there are certain parts of Al-Aqsa Mosque where the Israeli police for many years prevented Muslims from using and praying in these parts. The Golden Gate itself, which should have been the seat of the Imam Al-Ghazali chair for many years, they have used police orders to prevent Muslims from praying there. It is still considered problematic, and last week the head of the Islamic higher council, different from the Waqf council, he was summoned for interrogation, and one of the things that they have raised issue with him was why he prays at that particular location, the Golden Gate, which is part of Al-Aqsa Mosque. In the year 2003, the Israeli police took it upon themselves. Of course, they would not act without the political level being informing them that they can do so. They started bringing in Jewish, from our perspective, that's intrusion, because it's not, it's a violation of the status quo. The Waqf administration should have been in charge of all those who enter, Muslims or non-Muslims. And from the year 2003, they started bringing those people to Al-Aqsa Mosque, accompanied by an Israeli security force, and they have changed the course where they use to walk, and today it includes always the eastern part of the mosque, where they do pray inside the mosque. They do davening, and this really lately caused the police to take action against one of them going to court, but probably later on we'll shed more light on this. Al-Aqsa Mosque is itself about 144 dunams. That's a little bit more than 36 acres, like the Umayyad Mosque, like the Blue Mosque in Istanbul, like the Haram in Mecca, in Min Medina. You always have a certain courtyard which is part of the mosque, and there should be no security forces interfering in the life of the community. We in the story of Abraham, the biblical narrative is that when he needed a burial place for his wife, for Sarah, he paid money, silver shekels. The shekel is mentioned there in the I believe it was 400 silver shekels, but at any rate, it's he did not tell people, God gave me this. He just behaved like a good citizen. He needed the burial place and he paid for that. And that does not create, inheritance, let's say, for others. The problem at the Ibrahimi Mosque now is that since the massacre that Baruch Goldstein did at the Ibrahimi Mosque, killing people, Muslims while they were praying, the problem is that the Israeli government decided to divide the mosque, and the division in itself is not sharing. It's a forced arrangement, and they have about 64% of the building to themselves, and we have now 10 days of the year in which Muslims cannot pray at the mosque at all. This is because of the Jewish holidays, and this is something that is forced on us. In September, about 90 times the call for prayer was not allowed at the Ibrahimi Mosque, and that's another not only it's problematic, but really it defies the very purpose. And we talk about our presence. I don't have a claim. I mean, this is really one of the most important things. I don't have a claim, to be Palestinian. I am. I don't have a claim that it's a mosque. It is. I don't have a claim, just to by being here. A long time ago, I mean, when Descartes in the famous Cartesian method, so you talk about I think, therefore I am. I thought to myself, he doesn't have to say all that. I think, therefore I am. I am is enough. And in my case here, I am here. My language is being denied. On the road to Jericho, my language is not part of the public space. The Good Samaritan sign on the road to Jericho, it's a massive sign. In English, it says the Good Samaritan. In Hebrew, it says Hashomroni Hatov. In Arabic, it says the exact Hebrew words, the two words, but in Arabicized Hebrew, Hashomroni Hatov. And they passed the law in the Knesset to downgrade the status of Arabic, which is the language of a civilization. It's the language of the region. It's the language of the people with whom you are supposed to have peace. But it's it's not only downgrading the status of the language legally. It's not seeing us on equal living, and this is why we don't share the water. We don't have the same percentage of water. The settlers have, the Jewish settlers, that is, they have access to water that we don't have access to. And in fact, in the town of Bani Naim, they buy the water from the settlers. That water exists beneath their feet, but the PA, the Palestinian Authority, is not allowed free hand in getting the water and giving people. The occupation controls all of these things. What we have as a relationship with the land so far, it's been, if we talk about strictly speaking Islamic presence, that's 14 centuries of continuous presence. The life under the Crusaders for about 90 years, it's definitely was a big challenge, and massacres took place at the very beginning, but it did not really prevent Islamic presence from continuing. We know this in the rest of the land of Palestine. I believe that Umar ibn Khattab did the right thing when he arrived in the city around the year 636, 37, 38, whatever was the case, and he allowed the Jews back in the city, in the old city. I mean, there was no city outside the walls anyhow. The Jews were not allowed for a few centuries from living in the city, and here we have the Muslims allowing them to live in the city. I don't have that privilege, and my life in Jerusalem is not protected. They passed laws where they considered us as newcomers, and this is why it's almost like for us in East Jerusalem, we enjoy that. It's like a green card, status, being Toshav resident. We are not citizens in East Jerusalem, and they passed laws where if the center of your life is outside Israel, you lose that residency, and that's not fair. It's not applied to Israeli Jews, it's applied to us Palestinians in East Jerusalem. And we don't have citizenship of any country, by the way. We use travel documents when we travel, and part of East Jerusalem, 86% of East Jerusalem was confiscated in 1967 after the war, and they have changed the names of our schools. The school to which I went as a kid in my neighborhood was called the Al-Qadir Husseini. He was a famous Palestinian leader, and it was changed. The name of the school was changed. Street names were changed, and when I say these things, yes, it's an opportunity, but there is like a certain, it's very heavy. I'm old enough to know that I should not be scoring points, but I'm old enough to know that I really should say what I have to say, because yes to sharing, but unless we talk about a structure that recognize all the people on the land on equal footing, without privileging any background. What the Rabbi mentioned about the myths, that's, should not be translated into private roads for the settlers where the Palestinians cannot, use the land. Let's remember, until 1948, Jews owned between 5% to 6% of the land. Talk about the memoirs of Rabbi. He realized that it was necessary from their Zionist perspective to drive the Palestinians out from their home and drive them in the direction of Ramallah, to walk these 15 or 18 kilometers or what have you. That's not sharing. I think we, later on during the questions and answers, part, we will be able to answer other parts, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abu Sway, for that very personal and powerful witness, and for widening our historical consciousness, and also reminding us of the eschatological literature around Jerusalem, which also is very important. I'd like to move now and introduce our third panelist, Reverend Dr. Elise Cannon. Dr. Cannon is the Executive Director of Churches for Middle East Peace and an ordained pastor in the Evangelical Covenant Church. Dr. Cannon formerly served as the Senior Director of Advocacy and Outreach for World Vision US on Capitol Hill in Washington, and as a consultant to the Middle East for Child Advocacy Issues for Compassion International in Jerusalem. She's the author of several books, including the award-winning Social Justice Handbook, Small Steps for a Better World, her recent book, Beyond #Activism, and she is editor of A Land Full of God, Christian Perspectives on the Holy Land. Dr. Cannon.
Thank you, Professor Kelley. And I know it's the first time we've had the opportunity to meet face to face. I should tell all of you, I have a son that is getting married in Boston next year. So I would love to meet you in person and to have the opportunity to not have to have this type of gathering virtually. But in the meantime, I'm grateful to be with you, and I'm grateful for those who have gone before me. Rabbi Penzner, I loved your words that you closed with about the Jewish obligation to love all who dwell in the land. And I think that we all people who self-identify as Christian would say that we have a similar obligation. So some of what I want to talk about is ways that Christians have engaged in conversations about the Holy Land where we have not been the most constructive contributors. But I'll get to that in a minute. And I wanted to say thank you as well to Dr. Abu Sway, who, if I am reading everything right, and you actually are based in Jerusalem, you have paid the greatest price to be here with us this evening, as it's somewhere around 2 a.m. In Jerusalem. So shukran katir, it is good to be with you wherever you are geographically located. So in the few minutes that I have to introduce myself, and I want to talk a little bit about the work of Churches for Middle East Peace, I thought I would tell you a bit of my personal journey. One, just to give you a point of context, but two, to also discuss that no one Christian perspective toward the Holy Land is monolithic. And Christianity in the United States is complex, let alone in the world. And we could spend hours and hours just talking about the 30 member communions that are a part of the organization that I lead, Churches for Middle East Peace. But before I get to that, I wanted to introduce to you a little bit of my background. I am ordained, and I am a woman, and I'm ordained by one of the few evangelical denominations that ordains women. So I am an evangelical. The organization I lead is broadly ecumenical, but my evangelical theological framework and my background, I think, actually will be quite helpful as we talk about this conversation of what might a shared Jerusalem look like, or what would it mean for Christians, Muslims, and Jews to be able to share this land that we all call holy. And so I come from this evangelical background. I served in pastoral ministry for many, many years. And then I went on this spiritual pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And I often say that God called me to two things in my life. One was to ministry and to the service of the Lord. And the second thing was to the Middle East, in Jerusalem, in one of the sacredest sites in Christendom, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I felt this calling in my spirit that God had called me to engage in ministry in the Middle East. And so at that time, I was serving at a local church in California. I was getting a PhD in US history. And I went to my dissertation advisor and I said, I want to write about Israel. And he said, you do realize that your PhD is in US history, don't you? And what that ended up becoming was the bulk of my research, and my PhD was on the historic engagement of American Protestants in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the title of the dissertation, I think, is quite telling. It's called Mischief Making in Palestine, because in large part, Christian historical engagement in this land that we call holy has been incredibly divisive. And I say that regardless of if Christians are on the side of the Jewish people, I don't believe there is just one side, or the side of the Palestinian people, of which I also don't agree that there is one side. So I don't mean that. We can talk specifically, of course, about what I mean in that regard. But Christians, I don't have time to go through the whole history of Christian engagement in the Middle East, but if we look at the modern times, or just at some of the large contributions of Christians, and I'm talking about global Christians, I'm not talking about the indigenous Christian population yet. I think we absolutely need to elevate the voices of Palestinian Christians and of Christians in Israel, be they Palestinian or Jewish Christians. In large part, global Christian engagement has had an approach to the Holy Land that has been very imperialistic. I actually call it theological imperialism. We could talk about the restorationist movement of the 20th century. It actually predated the Jewish Zionist movement, where Christians said that the Jewish people have to be restored to their historic homeland in order for Christ to come again. You might have heard of this. We're talking about passages of sacred texts that speak to eschatological fulfillment. We in Christianity certainly have some of those texts. And restorationists, or restorationism, was a theology that was a precursor to a later theology that came to be known as Christian Zionism, which adopted many of these restorationist beliefs. And what's really, really interesting is when you look at specifically the history of American Christian engagement in the Holy Land, is that there have been some significant shifts historically. For example, in 1948, at the time where the war between the Israeli-Arab War was occurring, the establishment of the State of Israel being viewed as a miracle by the Jewish people, that same event resulting in nearly 1 million Palestinian refugees and being called the Nakba, the great catastrophe by the Palestinian people. What were American Christians? What was their point of engagement, and how did they contribute at that moment in history? And what's interesting is the most ardent supporters of the establishment of the State of Israel in the United States were not Christian conservatives or Christian fundamentalists or Christian evangelicals. It was actually Protestant liberals who had this profound empathy and this justice perspective for Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. The most ardent supporters of the establishment of the State of Israel were actually Protestant liberals at 1948. And fundamentalists, in large part, were incredibly anti-Semitic. And so there was a significant shift after 1948, where Protestant liberals who were looking at the Holy Land with this frame of justice had this great empathy for Jewish refugees coming out of the Shoah, the Holocaust. And with this great empathy, they became introduced to the Palestinian refugee population as a result of the Nakba. And some of the leading, for decades later, the leading advocates of Palestinian refugees and Palestinian justice and Palestinian human rights then became Protestant liberals. We'll fast forward a few years and look at 1967. The Six-Day War for American Christians was a turning point where I talked about how some of the conservatives and fundamentalists in 1948 were actually not proponents of the establishment of the State of Israel. By 1967, the United States had changed. The US was in the middle of the civil rights movement, and you had significant things happening within our society that for conservative Christians, evangelicals, fundamentalists, and other conservative Christians, what was happening in the United States was so concerning that they actually thought the world was coming to an end. Not only the civil rights movement, but you also had the movement for women's rights and, free love and the hippie movement and movements in the 1970s. And that, and again, I'm making a bit of a broad brushstroke. I started out by saying Christian perspectives are not monolithic, but you saw this large movement of American Christians who were conservative in the 60s, heading into the Six-Day War in 67, and then in the early 70s, who all of a sudden saw the Six-Day War and Israel's winning of that war and the territory that was the control that Israel took of the territory as a result of the Six-Day War was viewed by these conservative Christians as nothing less than a miracle of God that not only meant that God was on the side of the Jewish people of Israel, but that this was a symbol that Christ was going to come again. So many of you might be familiar in 1972, I believe it was, the early 1970s, one of the most impactful books called This Late Great Planet Earth was published that talked about some of these ideas and the role of the nation state of Israel and the Jewish people in the fulfillment of end times prophecies. Parallel to that, in US government and politics, you had what was known as the rise of the new right. And again, I'm sorry I'm doing these broad brushstrokes of history because I know we only have a few minutes together. But as we look at Christendom in the United States, and as we look at different denominations and different segments of Christianity, you have American Christian Zionists, you have kind of these buckets, which again, they're not monolithic, but there are some things that are in common with these different definitions. And that brings me a little bit to the work that I do today. So I am the executive director of an organization called Churches for Middle East Peace. And serving in this role is the greatest privilege, and I will be honest, also the greatest challenge. We have 30 member communions. That means denominations or organizations. These are the highest level of Christian organizations in the United States. And those 30 member communions represent a number of the traditional churches of the Holy Land, the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of North America, the Antiochian Orthodox Church, the Armenian Orthodox Church, for example. We have close relationships with the Coptic Orthodox Church, which of course comes from Egypt. So the Orthodox communions, we have a number of mainline Protestant groups that are a part of our membership: Episcopalians, the Presbyterian Church of the United States, the ELCA, is the Evangelical Lutheran Church. I won't go through all 30, I promise. I just want you to have an idea of the diversity of our membership, which we would call broadly ecumenical in terms of church-based denominations. We have a number of evangelical denominations that are a part of our group. The denomination that I'm ordained in, the Evangelical Covenant Church. And then we have peace churches, such as the Quakers, American Friends Service Committee, the Friends Committee for National Legislation, the Church of the Brethren. And the reason I share that with you is because the diversity of our membership represents a broad segment of American Christianity. And these groups, which goes from Orthodox on one side to Unitarian Universalists on the other, these 30 denominations don't agree on hardly anything. We don't agree on theology. We don't agree on the role of Scripture. We don't agree on the person of Christ. We don't agree on issues of atonement. And yet, over the last 30 plus years, these denominations have come together to unanimously agree to policy positions that are specific to what peace would look like in the Middle East. The majority of our work focuses on Israel-Palestine, but not only. And so some of the things that we'll continue to talk about: a vision of a shared Jerusalem. We say the sacred city for two peoples and three faith traditions, where all Jews and all Palestinians would have access to worship, to freedom, and Christians, Muslims, and Jews would be able to worship where human rights and dignity are honored in this sacred city that we call holy. So that's a small glimpse of what our ecumenical work looks like at Churches for Middle East Peace. We're an advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. And one of the challenges of what we do is we have to hold in tension an approach that's a multi-narrative approach. We want to hear all of the voices and perspectives of people coming from the land, while at the same time not compromising on issues of human rights and justice. And so sometimes this can very much seem to be in tension. How can we hear all perspectives and yet talk about power differentials and talk about human rights concerns? So our advocacy priorities are focused on three primary things: holistic peace building, which emphasizes this multi-narrative approach. We focus significantly on the sustainability of the Christian community in the land. And I would be remiss to not talk about the Palestinian Christian church that has existed in Jerusalem and in the Holy Land since the time of Pentecost. There have been Arab Christians, Arab Jews who became converts of the person of Christ more than 2,000 years ago. And that Palestinian Christian population today is very, very small, less than 1% in the West Bank and Gaza, small numbers of, in large part, Palestinian Christians, but not only Palestinians, Christians that are living in Israel, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. So one of our commitments at CMEP, Churches for Middle East Peace, is the sustainability of our brothers and sisters in Christ while we try to embrace this multi-narrative approach. In addition to holistic peace building, we focus significantly on economic and humanitarian issues. We look at the per capita income of Jews living in Israel and Palestinians living in Jerusalem, Palestinians living in the West Bank, and Palestinians living in Gaza. And so much of our emphasis on humanitarian and economic support focuses on Gaza, which has some of the greatest humanitarian needs that we see around the world today: a lack of access to electricity, a lack of access to potable water. And there's all types of geopolitical considerations that need to be discussed on each of these issues. What's Israel's responsibility? What role does the Palestinian Authority play? What role does Hamas play? What about Egypt? And so we try to pay attention to those contributing factors while calling on particularly the US government to humanitarian support, but also while moving towards economic sustainability and addressing systemic causes of why there's such severe economic differentials between Palestinians and Israelis. Our third primary advocacy priority is human rights, where we believe and want to support equality and justice and the ability to prosper for all people in the land. Jews, Muslims, Christians, Israelis, and Palestinians. And so that is a part of our vision as well. And my closing comment, I just wanted to check the time to see how I'm doing. My closing comment is I wanted to just mention, I know Dr. Kelley talked about this book, A Land Full of God, that I had the privilege of editing. This book is about Christian perspectives on the Holy Land. It has 30 chapters. A third of the chapters are by people who might self-identify as Christian Zionists. A lot of them would be unilaterally supportive of the state of Israel. A third of the chapters would be Palestinian solidarity perspectives. Archbishop Desmond Tutu gave us a chapter, and I'm going to tell you the title of it. I know it's a controversial term, but the title of his chapter is Apartheid. And then the rest of the chapters in the book seek to have a multi-narrative approach, Christian perspectives that can honor Jewish narratives, that can talk about the historic significance of the land to the Jewish people, while also acknowledging indigenous Palestinians and Palestinian Muslim and Christian aspirations in the land. And so I will point you to this book as a reference. In a minute, I'll put a link to it in the chat. But the introduction was written by a dear Muslim and Jewish too, a Muslim friend of mine and a Jewish friend of mine. Aziz Abu Sarah is a Jerusalemite, an Islamic Jerusalemite, and he co-wrote the introduction with Rabbi Dr. Daniel Roth, who is a dear, dear friend of mine. And I just wanted to read these words as a blessing over us as we continue the conversation. So they're speaking about the book, A Land Full of God. And they said, may this be a starting point to expanding our understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Read it with an open mind. Learn from the narratives of Christians who view the conflict in a variety of ways. In whatever ways you can, listen and hear the stories of the people who live in the land, Israelis, Palestinians, Jews, Muslims, Christians, and other communities. Travel if you're able, see the beautiful multi-narratives at work in the Holy Land. Pursue peace, but do not do so with only one interpretation of peace in mind. Pursue peace that honors and respects all of the opposing narratives of God's children in a land full of God. So that is my hope and prayer. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cannon. I learned from the Q&A that today is your birthday. So happy birthday.
Thank you. Yesterday, yes, that's right.
Yesterday, and for sharing your time with us this evening and reminding us of the great diversity among Christian attitudes and activism regarding the Holy Land. So what I'd like to do now is, since we want to leave plenty of time for questions and answers, we have over 200 participants in the webinar this evening, and many good questions have begun to appear in the Q&A function. So I would just simply like to ask each of the panelists if they would like to respond to one or two of the other panelists for just a few moments now. So Dr. Abu Sway, Dr. Cannon, Rabbi Penzner, if you'd just like to make a comment in response to something that one of your colleagues has said. Who would like to begin?
Barbara, I just spoke, so I'm deferring.
Barbara, we haven't heard from you for a bit. Would you like to comment on anything that your colleagues have mentioned?
I want to thank both of them for their honest and heartfelt sharing of the difficulties of this struggle, and particularly to Dr. Abu Sway for outlining so many of the challenges and offenses to Muslim worship and to Muslim life, particularly in Jerusalem. I agree that that and as he described, the inequities of water, the different judicial systems that exist over the Green Line, those are all inequities and they all need to be addressed. And I would I would argue that those inequities need to be addressed even before we come to a political solution of the occupation. That those are, and in fact, I well aware of many groups in Israel who are working on these issues. Particularly, I want to lift up Terrestrial Jerusalem and Daniel Seidman and the work he's doing around the city of Jerusalem and educating people about those injustices of which you spoke. Thank you very much for sharing your pain.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Dr. May. I agree with you. There are those who work and you have rabbis for human rights who, at times they rebuilt the same home in Isawiya several times and it would be demolished. And Erica Sherman, he was even attacked by Jewish settlers in the West Bank. It's well documented on video. And a couple of days ago, you have several hundred Israelis who traveled all the way to Yatta, south of in the southern Hebron hills, just to be in solidarity with the Palestinians of Yatta, who are simply not left alone. People who live on the outskirts of that area, and simply they are attacked because the settlers have their eyes on the land. They have been even prevented from living in caves in that region. The situation is extremely difficult, as you well know, and this is why love is something that is really, something that is extremely beautiful. But I would settle for justice. I mean, this is really just simply an equitable situation. And as you said, we don't need to wait until the end of the occupation. Certain things need to be done immediately. It's just like we are not seen on the same level, and that's why our needs are not seen on the same level. Some stories are striking. This is really it haunts me, the very issue of losing your own residency in your own city in the year 2008. And despite the fact that I believe that we have a certain link to religion, and we try to see something to present that which is humanitarian, which is not a negation of religion in itself, but sometimes religion does not present itself in the best form. In the year 2008, when Eli Ishai from Shas was the Minister of the Interior, it took about 4,577 Palestinians. Look, B'Tselem, the Israeli Human Rights Watch group, look at statistics. In 1 year, almost 5,000 people lost their residency, lost their ID. It means that they were kicked out of the city. If they come back, they come back as visitors, as tourists, if they are allowed back. And these people, they have been living, they are part of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is part of them. They probably don't have the experience of living somewhere else. And by the way, there were surveys of Palestinian youngsters. The overwhelming majority at that moment of the survey, they said they would like to leave the country. They don't want to live here anymore. It's not that they are not Palestinians. It's not that they don't love Palestine. It's very tiring to live under the occupation, systematically. Their rights, there is no freedom of movement. There is no, people don't have, I have met youngsters, in their 20s sometimes, who have never been to Al-Aqsa Mosque, though they live simply a few miles away, but simply because they are from West Bank. And the Gaza Strip, just don't mention it. Whether they are Muslims or Christians, usually around Easter, the Israeli military issues some few hundred permits to the Christians to come to Jerusalem and Bethlehem, on and on. Whether all aspects of our life are controlled. But again, I'm not saying that that there is no possibility of some measure of relief, but that's not enough. We need full recognition, just to be like everybody else. Everybody like us. I don't know what this means. Like everybody else in Europe, like everybody else next door. We don't have the same. We don't have the same privileges.
Thank you, Dr. Abu Sway. I would like now to move us to the open question and answer period so that we have time. We have already a number of questions in the queue. So I'm going to read the question in the order of their submission and ask any one of you to respond and to just respond with a few sentences so that we can begin to get a sense of the richness of the thinking among our participants. The first question is, as a Muslim, I was horrified to see booted, armed Israeli security forces enter Al-Aqsa Mosque and disrupt the worshippers during Ramadan. Everyone should have the right to worship in peace. What can we do from here on to maintain the sanctity of this holy space?
Okay, it's the occupation. I mean, what else you can do? It's I don't think that the status quo has been eroded systematically, and it poses a big challenge for the Muslim worshippers. Our IDs are checked and registered at the gates of Al-Aqsa Mosque. We don't have free access to all parts of Al-Aqsa Mosque. We cannot basically, if we talk about this past Ramadan, at the end of Ramadan, this May this year, the problem began, I think, the most problematic part was really outside the mosque, Damascus Gate. We don't have much public space for East Jerusalemites. It became like a dormitory now. Olmert himself, when he was mayor, before he became prime minister, he's on record saying that 96% of public parks are in West Jerusalem. And we don't talk about charity. Also, Israeli newspapers, they have long time ago published the fact that only 10 to 12% of our property tax called Arnona is returned to us in terms of services. So they could create more public space. So Damascus Gate, which is like an amphitheater now, the kids have been, they go after Ramadan, after the end of the day of Ramadan, after they break fast, they just go and hang around the amphitheater. And Ir Amim, an Israeli NGO, their officer in the field made the first report that the attack of the police on those youngsters was unprovoked, the very beginning. And then things deteriorated. There were those of goodwill from both sides who wanted to do something, but was very little and too late, and things erupted. They have their public space in West Jerusalem. They have, the Etzion Square. They have the Ben Yehuda Street, which is really without any, it's only for pedestrians. They can stroll around. They have public space. They have the parks. For our youngsters, that's the only space where they can hang around. But for the Al-Aqsa Mosque, this is the restriction on worshippers is systematic, and you have these heavy boots and a very large number of them all the time.
Thank you, Doctor. A question for Rabbi Penzner. What does it mean to have a total claim to the land? Do you mean exclusive, controlling, covering the entire area instead of only one part of the area? So it's an opportunity for you, Barbara, to kind of explain that statement you made.
I appreciate that because it's a shocking statement. And when I first heard it in the tent at Roots, it took me aback. And then I realized that we're not talking about a political claim. There have been political entities coming and going. They don't endure. We're talking about an enduring, sacred claim that's in our hearts and part of our identities. This is not about an exclusive claim. That's the point of being able to listen with empathy and compassion, but also with integrity and authenticity, which is the model that I am supporting, that is happening on the ground in many places. And I appreciate that justice is not happening quickly enough. And I appreciate that there are extremists on both sides with whom we can't dialogue. I'm not talking about a naive kind of love, that love will conquer all. I am talking about recognizing that when Palestinians make a claim to the land, it's not asking for all the Jews to be removed. And when Jews say Hebron is at the heart of our Torah experience, of our people, I don't want to live in Hebron, but I do understand that claim as part of the identity of people, Muslim and Jewish, who live there. And I've discovered when people listen to each other with that kind of empathy and compassion and integrity and speaking truth, that actually people come to more understanding and are more likely to get to justice than if we simply take sides.
Another question for you, Rabbi. Would you be willing to share something about your and your sister's efforts to listen to one another across your differences over the years, and what lessons you have learned from those efforts?
I am so grateful for that question, especially because I think my sister's going to listen to this recording when she wakes up tomorrow. And this has been a long effort, beginning 30 years ago when she made Aliyah and she was living in Israel, and we would not speak about religion or politics. And over time, each of us came to, I hope, some kind of wisdom or maturity, but also recognition of the love that we share, that if there's going to be any kind of understanding, we needed to speak to each other honestly and with compassion. And so I spent many years refusing to go to their home out of a principle. And when her daughter said to me, I really want you to come for this family event, I spent a lot of time in discernment, and I went and I spoke to a lot of the settlers there, and they really appreciated my being present. And one aspect of the story was that I had been to Roots and I was telling them about it. And sadly, I heard a story of someone in the family who had a very negative experience there. So when we got a request for the Run for Reconciliation that Roots has just sponsored worldwide, and I saw that of the 35 people who were registered to do that run in the West Bank, my sister and my brother-in-law were among them. They have come to a place of understanding and recognition, and I believe I have too. And that's, it's a long-term effort, but we believe that being there for each other is really what's essential, and it's going to help bring about breaking down of barriers and coming together for justice.
Thank you. Dr. May, this person wants to thank you for your look at a Christian perspective. The question is, where does the end of time scenario, the eschatological scenario figure into Middle East peace for the churches in your organization? How important a factor is that?
The majority of denominations that are a part of Churches for Middle East Peace, even the evangelical ones, would not institutionally adhere to a theology of Christian Zionism or a theology that would presume Jewish restoration to their historic homeland as a prerequisite for the coming of Christ. Now, that doesn't mean just because a denomination has a certain theological belief or assumption, it doesn't mean that their followers would share that. There certainly are Christian Zionists that are part of churches, that are a part of our denominations, and we work with individual churches and individuals as well. And honestly, I personally have spoken to a number of Christian Zionist groups who all they mean by their identification as a Christian Zionist is a certain belief about the history of the Jewish people as they read and interpret the Hebrew scriptures. And what's really, really beautiful is when you I have spoken to many, many people who, if you are able to show them a way where they can be advocates of justice for Palestinians while honoring Jewish claims to the land and their theological beliefs about the Jewish people, they don't see those as contradictory claims. And so that's actually really, really beautiful, because then you have people who self-identify, and most of them wouldn't even use the terminology of Christian Zionists. That's just a broad term that summarizes some of their theological assumptions. But then you have people who I think are moving increasingly toward a perspective that is really honoring multi-narratives and is in pursuit of not this empty peace, but a peace that has justice at its roots.
Here's a follow-up question for you. How do you suggest we more productively invite our Christian congregations, mine is Quaker, says the questioner, to care about our fellow Christians in Israel, Palestine?
That's a wonderful, wonderful question. And that is at the heart of what we do at Churches for Middle East Peace. So we say educate, elevate, and advocate. We don't want to speak on behalf. I'm so grateful we have voices from the land speaking here. I can speak to Christians in the United States. I am one. That's our focus. That's our constituency. And so we want to elevate the voices of the land, to elevate the voices of activists. We want to educate. I mean, one of the things, I have my PhD, I have 2 doctorates and 3 master's degrees. And the only reason I share that is there's a million things I don't know about what's happening on the ground in Israel, Palestine. And I'm incredibly educated. And so for us to have a posture of learning together, and Churches for Middle East Peace will bring in speakers, and we seek to bring in Muslim speakers, Jewish speakers, Israelis, Palestinians. We do domestic speaking tours that are called pilgrimage to peace tours, where we travel together to the Holy Land. And so we have, in that model of educate, elevate, advocate, we seek to provide opportunities to have conversations like this in our local churches.
Thank you. Here's a question for any one of the 3 of you. We have some students in the webinar participants tonight, which is great. And this student apparently is writing a paper. So his question is, was there ever a period in history when Jerusalem was shared between the 3 major religions? And if it's okay, can he use your names to cite in his paper? So there's a question of history that some of you have addressed in part, but if you'd like to clarify that for the questioner, that'd be great. Was there ever a time when Jerusalem was shared between the 3 major religions? I think the implication in the question is peacefully.
Maybe I'll go first and someone can fill in. My understanding from a historical perspective is absolutely, never absolute peace, but historically Jews, Christians, and Muslims living in the sacred city of Jerusalem, they were one another's neighbors. And my understanding of Jerusalem prior, in the early 20th century, for example, the Shabbat Goy for Jews who were observing the Sabbath was the local Muslim baker who, the Jewish families would take their food to the bakery. And if they were poor, they would take little bits of food. And if they were rich, they would take abundant amounts of food. And it was the Muslim baker's job on the Shabbat to distribute the food so that all of the Jewish people observing the Sabbath would have food. And I don't think those stories are just idealistic. I believe, we see stories about children who were raised, by Jewish and Muslim neighbors, and Christians were amongst them as well. So my understanding is historically peace has been possible in our sacred city.
It's, I did mention Umar al-Khattab welcoming the Jews back to the city. And since then, the followers of the 3 religions, they did live in the city, and what we have today, we do have for example, the Christian Quarter, but that's a bit misleading when you look at the tourist map of the whole city of Jerusalem having 4 quarters, because look at the Muslim Quarter. On that map, those of you who really who know the the old city like the palm of their hands. They know what I'm talking about. Enter through Lion's Gate. To your right, it's basically Mary's birthplace. And it's a massive complex. And this is supposed to be the Muslim quarter. Next, basically, same side, north of the Via Dolorosa, you have the Church of Flagellation. Then you have Cohomo, then another church, then the Austrian Hospice. And you are already now almost in the center of the old city. On the other side, you have an Armenian, church, an Armenian building, third, fourth station, and then you continue. And all these institutions are in the supposedly the Muslim quarter. As I said, this is really more of a tourist, maybe a political map, but does not reflect the complex reality on the ground. More complex, my late mother breastfed the daughter of our neighbor who was Christian. And according to Islamic law, Sharia, if you will, according to Islamic law, Lamis became my sister, I became her brother. We don't inherit each other, but we are prohibited against marrying each other. And that's between neighbors. And it was done away from cameras. They're probably, unless it's a family story, you would not know about all these things. We did live together. No whitewashing of history, but for most of these 1400 years, things were okay as a communal, basically, relationship. When you talk about external forces meddling in the affairs of the region, and especially modern colonial times, this is really, we're still living that, unfortunately, the negative impact of these modern colonial times. They have disappeared as direct, for the most part. In fact, they're returning to the old model, one way or the other, did take place. But unless we are left to figure out our, the way forward, we will still suffer because of that external interference.
This next question is complicated, but very pointed, and I think it's worth honoring. It's a bit long. The questioner says, I am horrified at the young settlers destroying Palestinian orchards, beating up farmers and killing animals. I read that the Israeli peace are complicit in these unjust acts. I don't understand why the Israeli government does nothing to stop these atrocities. I am also horrified at young children being shot in their eyes by snipers and jailed at age 12. Now, again, the questioner is stating these. We don't claim that these are all facts. I was raised Jewish and converted to Islam and grew up with myths in my Jewish family that were racist toward Arabs. And here's the question. At the core of these issues is racism. Do you agree? Again, a pointed, challenging question. At the core of everything we're talking about, this questioner suggests, is not religion as much as racism. Do you agree?
Let me take a stab at that, because I am horrified by those stories. I'm horrified by the killing of children of settlers and horrified by the killing of Palestinians. And the inequity in the justice system is, I don't think I'm being controversial here. Many people have called it an apartheid system, that the way that Palestinians are treated by the judicial system is completely separate from the way that settlers are treated by the judicial system. That's one of the changes that needs to be made, whether as soon as possible. And it is horrific. And I would agree that this isn't an issue of religion. I'm not going to, I wouldn't jump to any other term for it, but it's not a religious divide. I think there are many complicated issues, and I think that, to be honest, human beings make friends and they make enemies. And I can only draw hope from my religious tradition to say, I have seen friends become enemies, I have seen enemies become friends, and I continue to believe that we have to remain open to speaking to one another, perhaps not to the most extreme. We're not going to change their minds. But if people of good faith continue to speak to each other and to call each other out with human rights abuses and with injustices and with massacres, then we will make progress and create a culture on both sides that will bring ultimately a political solution.
May or Mustafa, would you like to comment on that?
I mean, it's the statistics basically speak for themselves in terms of kids being shot in the eye or being even killed, or sometimes basically shot in the back of their, like walking away from the soldiers. All these have been documented. The judicial system, the settlers, the Israeli law applies to settlers, but military law applies to the Palestinians. So it's at the discretion of the military. They can do whatever they like to with the home of the Palestinian, making it a political base, a military base temporarily. It could be a day, it could be a week, it could be more. They sometimes just push the whole family into one room and they just use the house. The problem will be even more difficult when you talk about there is a rabbi from the Gosh Atzion, just south of Bethlehem. This rabbi wrote a book called Torah HaMelech, the King's Torah, but the Israeli media highlighted a very problematic part of that book, in which he justified killing Palestinian children because they will grow up to become enemy. And this is, this is very a very difficult, text, and if it's used to educate kids or basically influence adults, then this is really definitely will keep the problem of the problems of the occupation ongoing. You cannot basically sugarcoat the action of the military. It's an occupation. What do you do? I mean, it's it will never be okay. And unless we talk about the end of the, what brings us closer to the end of the occupation? I mean, what can we do? And if we don't really address the issue, heads on, then interfaith dialogue might become an end in itself, a cushion. Is sometimes even escapism, that you'll feel good about yourself that you have participated in interfaith dialogue, while the conditions on the ground, they have not, improved a lot. This is the trigger happy, for whatever reason, soldier, and you have those who, conscientious soldiers who speak, against the occupation, and they get imprisoned, but they break the silence. That's basically the name of the group.
Maybe I'll pick up there, if I may. I think one of the things you just articulated, Imam, is about the cost of sometimes being willing to have interfaith dialogue. And I know that there are certainly churches and Christians in the United States who are unwilling to compromise good relationship with our Jewish neighbors by entering into conversations about this conflict or about issues like the occupation. And I think that's something that we as the Christian community have to confess, that if there ever is going to be peace, I think of Martin Luther King Jr.'s quote about how peace is not possible unless justice is also present. And so that is a very real reality. But I want to return to your question, Professor Kelley, about racism. And I believe all of our societies are racialized. We could certainly talk about the Black Lives Matter movement and racial conversations domestically in the United States. We could talk about racialized aspects of the Israeli society, the treatment of Ethiopian Jews, certainly in Palestine and the Palestinian territories as well. Race is a component, but I would suggest that racism is a component of what's happening, but the privileging of nationalistic identity is as much an issue as race in the midst of this conflict. And so, we're talking about the different systems of laws in the West Bank, the Jewish people being under civil protection and civil law, and Palestinians in the West Bank and the occupied territories being under military law. That is not, racism is a component of that, but there are other factors at play, I would suggest.
Thank you, May. Thank you to all of our three panelists and to all of our participants. This is not an easy conversation. It's not an easy topic, and you, our panelists, have handled it with compassion, understanding, and courage, and we all appreciate that. The topic for the webinar next week will certainly continue some of the themes we've spoken about this evening. The question for next week is, can we acknowledge, reflecting on our histories and narrative, can we acknowledge? So I invite all of you who have joined us this evening to please come back next week and enjoy the opportunity to learn from one another. We encourage you to continue this conversation with your family members, with your friends and colleagues. And once again, it's not too late to sign up for the succeeding two webinars, so please feel free to do that. We want to remind you as we leave this evening of the commitment that brought all of us here, to be part of creating a more peaceful and just present and future for Israelis and Palestinians. We ask you to take a moment to complete the online survey that will be sent to you. And we thank you with the words with which we began. Shalom, salam, peace.